Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another review. Today I'm reviewing the second film in the Nightmare on Elm Street series that Wes Craven directed, and it is the last in the original solo series, because the next two films, one was a crossover and the other was a remake. But it really, even though it is a part of the original series, it's basically its own side story. I guess you could say it's the movie equivalent of a what if. It, of course, is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And as I mentioned before, this was the second Nightmare on Elm Street film I saw, the first being, of course, Freddy's Dead. So I saw Very, Very Campy Freddy, then I went to Very, Very Dark Freddy. Then after this, I saw the original one, so, some of the stuff with this film I didn't notice the first time I watched it, but you can imagine a great introduction to Dark, Dark Freddy. Anyway, the film has a 6.4 on IMDb, very good score for this film, though I personally think it could be just a skoshi bit higher, but that's me. Has a 66 with the audience on Rotten Tomatoes and a 77 with the critics. Once again, I think that could be like a skoshi bit higher, like an 80 with the critics, maybe a 75 with the audience, but that's just me. As you can tell, it is a film that does have a good amount of people enjoying it. And according to some critics, the idea of the film is a sort of a prelude to Wes Craven's Scream series. And of course, if you think about it, yeah, it is. Though this one's made more so for the fans of the specific series, and of course the people that made the film, whereas Scream is made for horror fans and fans of cinema in general. So, narrow audience, wide audience. That's probably why the film didn't do as well as it should have. I mean, it was made for 8 million, but only made about 19.7 million, according to Wikipedia. It should have made more than that, but that's just me. I'm just glad it has a following. I don't know if I would say it has a cult following, but you could probably say it's probably on the cusp of what you would consider a cult following. I can definitely say it's one of my was definitely one of the entries in the series that I enjoy more. I go back and forth between what I say is my favorite film, but it's usually between this film, the first film, and Dream Warriors. Those are the ones I go back and forth on what my favorite of the solo films are. If I were to include the crossover Freddy vs. Jason, that would be in the conversation too, but just going off the solo films, it's between 1, 3, and this one. Not to say that I don't like 4, and I do like 2 to an extent, and I like some of the ideas of 5, but 5 would be thrown out of the conversation because of that. 2, I would say, is underrated, but I'll talk about that more when I one day down the line review that film again. But I go back and forth. But they just 1, 2, and 1, 3, and 5. No, 1, 3, and this one all have different things about them that it's kind of you can obviously see why someone will go back and forth why they like one more than the other. Now, the idea for this film originated in the script that Wes Craven originally did for Nightmare 3 at the time. New Line was like, yeah, it is, it's not a good idea. It doesn't really go with the idea that you established in the original film, considering some of the stuff that the later sequels did, even though some of it could make sense from the direction they go with it. And of course, especially what they do with the second sequel, even though, second sequel, so as a couple of my buddies have put it, the rules haven't been 100% established. But even with that, it's kind of funny that they would do stuff like that and then throw this idea out. It's like, that doesn't go with it. I don't know how much of the original script that he wrote was cannibalized into this film, but I'd say at least the general idea and then, of course, some of the events probably, but it was probably twisted a little bit because, the 10-year gap between the original and this one, and then also a lot of the stuff that had happened in pulp culture since then. Because one of the angles that this film goes from is how horror films affect those who watch them and make them. More so with make them, but there's also some of the thing in those who watch them. Like in one scene where Heather's character, the fictionalized version of herself, is being interviewed. They talk a little bit about it. And then, of course, the doctor character, which this is something I never really noticed about the character, as a kid. Maybe I noticed it subconsciously, but now I notice it more like out of it. It's like, oh, that's actually interesting, is the doctor character. You can really see she really has an axe to grind when it comes to horror films. And from what I've read, that character is loosely based on the head of the MPAA at the time. I'm gonna see if I can find the character's name. Oh, here it is. Fran Bennett played Dr. Christine Hefner. Last name taken from the head of the MPAA. Sorry about that. At the time, and apparently this person was the bane of Wes Craven's directorial existence at this time. Then again, the MPAA have always been the bane of people's existence, whether or not they go by like, oh, you can't put that in an R-rated film. That's only in an NC-17 film. You can't put that. Then, of course, to more recently butchering the PG-13 rating to where it's basically just PG with just like a little bit extra when it's supposed to be PG with hot sauce. Then again, that's a whole other day, another video, and Treckenberg from Good Bad Flicks argued that point a lot better in his thing. And another thing that's good about this film, I touched on it briefly, is that Krueger is portrayed closer to what Craven had originally imagined, darker and less comical. I mean, he's very dark in the first film, and he still is in 2 and 3 to a point. He's just a little bit more comical. And whatever humor he had in part 1 was very, very dark. And parts of it tie into the subtext that I mentioned about originally him being a child molester, but it was turned into subtext when they deleted the lines corresponding with it. And most of that humor comes from how he acts, and of course a couple of his lines. Not really many one-liners, that's the later films that introduced that. But most of it come from that, but then by the end he's very, very dark in that last scene. And how he is in that scene, that is how he is most of the time when you see Krueger on screen in this film. I mean, he has some moments of dark comedy when he does the phone calls, but from what I understand, originally someone else was supposed to be making the calls, like the babysitter or someone else. But then I like that they dropped that and make it seem like that it is Krueger himself doing it. In addition to him being darker, they updated his look. They changed the glove. It's more organic and it has a fifth claw. From what I understand, that kind of threw Englund off a little bit when he was playing this one, but I still think he did a good job, and I do like that little homage near the end that they have to Nosferatu. When Krueger's walking through the bedroom, you see the shadow in his claw, you see it on the thing, and then the claw comes out. That was a nice little homage. And then, of course, having him in the trench coat, that really adds to his new look. It's mostly in the last few scenes he's in, but it really adds to it. And the difference in makeup, while it does look like he's burnt, it looks kind of more like he's slightly burnt, but then like there's some like evil bursting out of his skin. If that makes any sense. It's more of a slightly demonic burnt look. I'd say even more demonic than when he's angry in Freddy vs. Jason for that brief little moment. And it adds to the slight change in how this Krueger is supposed to be. Now, the plot of the film is that it takes place in this weird reality based on our own, where the Nightmare on Elm Street series is, a bunch of films started by Wes Craven, made at New Line Cinema. And in the world, it's approaching the 10th anniversary of the first film. Despite Freddy being killed and Freddy's dead, the series is still popular. The fans are still clamoring for more, and they're still wondering if New Line's going to make a new one. Well, one day, Wes Craven informs the head of New Line, Bob Shea, that he's been getting an idea for a new one. And of course, Shea eventually contacts Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy in the original film and in part 3, and tells them that they're thinking of doing another one, that Wes is doing the script. But at the same time, Heather has been experiencing some weird things. She's been having some weird dreams, which is what the film opens with, a magnificent opening sequence, which at first makes you wonder if this is going to be the film, but then you see it's a dream, and it's the beginning of the blur of the line between reality and fiction. And she's also been being stalked and harassed by someone who she doesn't know who it is, which this is partially taken from her real life, which Wes managed to get permission from her, which I think helps the tone of the film. And she's talking with other people who were involved with these series, like John Saxon, Robert Englund, about it. And as Englund tells her in the later scene, Wes is not going to show it till he's finished. Well, as things go on, strange and dangerous things begin to happen. For starters, Heather's husband in the series, Chase Porter, or at least in this film, dies in a car accident, but when she sees the body, it looks like he's been clawed, which, as she finds out, partially this is due to him working on the new glove, and of course, you go from there that Freddy killed him because of that. And of course, what makes the husband character interesting is that in real life, Heather's husband is a special effects guy, so not much of a stretch. Although the actor that played him, looking for the actor real quick, David Newsom, he felt a little bit weird playing the special effects guy, more so when he saw the real special effects guys on the film. I mean, he felt a little too clean cut compared to these guys. These were guys like you'd see in a Viking movie, big burly beard, construction worker type outfits. He's like, I feel a little weird playing this. I feel like a preppy boy. That's the gist of what he said. But anyway, back onto the plot. Now, at the same time, her son starts acting a little weird. almost like someone's trying to get him, which is a nice little contrast because Heather now is basically in the same role her mother was in the first film, and a little bit of what her role in the first film was, where at first she's like, yeah, right, nothing's going on. Then she starts to see that her son is starting to act weird, and he's starting to show some of the symptoms that the Nancy character did in the first film, like not wanting to sleep. But of course, coming from a younger kid, you're gonna think it's the usual young kid things. Like there's some scenes that echo back to the childhood fears we all feel, like the monster in the closet, wanting to have the teddy bear by us and the nightlight on, which the teddy bear thing is incorporated into the character of Rex, which for me hits a personal note because I used to have I actually still do, I just don't know where he is, had a stuffed T-Rex thing, though it was based on Reptar from Rugrats. And actually I had it when I first saw this film, my brother mentioned it, and so it's a nice little, a little bit of nostalgia for me on that, but we all can connect with the whole childhood fear thing, which is embodied in the character of Dylan. I think the character's name is, Dylan. And it really is interesting to see how Freddy in this film plays on it. And it's the way he starts to come into this world, because it's just like how Freddy is in some of the normal films where he has to build up a certain amount of fear before he can start manipulating more stuff. In certain films, it's stuff in the dream world, and like in part 5, it's then infant dreams where he can start pulling her into the dream world at will. Then, of course, in the second film, it's him being able to enter the real world for any length of time. Or in this one, it's kind of like that, but it's more like him being able to manifest himself in either in the real world where at least certain people can see him, like Dylan and Heather. And even if they can't see him, he can still manipulate things, like when he kills the babysitter, which is a throwback to Tina's death in the first film. And as the film starts, he can barely do anything. There's the nightmare things, subtle manipulations like scaring Dylan, and of course the throwback to the bathtub scene with the claw coming out of the bed. Then, of course, manipulating the new claw to kill the husband. But other than that, it's more like the nightmare stuff, and then by the end, he can come into the reality of the film, which is what Wes Craven is writing the script to try to prevent. And of course, by the end, he has to deal with Heather, who is the gatekeeper, which the scene where Wes explains why he has to go through Heather is very good, and it makes a lot of sense if you think of the whole mythos of the series, that Heather played Nancy, who, as he put it, was the first character to humiliate Freddy and defeat him, even though Freddy did eventually kill Nancy in the series. If he wants to get into the real world, he'd have to get past the actress who played Freddy's first major nemesis. Then, of course, Heather's like, that was Nancy, not me. And then, of course, Wes just shoots back, but you were the one who gave Nancy her strength. Which is very true. And Heather even admits a little bit of this in the Never Sleep Again documentary, where she says she brought some of herself into the character, and that's why, as Nancy, she seems so natural. It's just, some more of the stronger stuff is stuff she, amplified herself. And makes me think of the whole thing about pro wrestling characters, that usually the best characters are the ones that include a little bit of yourself, but you amplify it. Like with Stone Cold, the beer drinking Texan, just amplify it to make a character, but some of that is still part of his own personality. Whereas with Nancy, it's a little bit of Heather, but she amplifies it. And of course, the whole mother thing is amplified in the last scene. And that whole last scene is basically just the gatekeeper scene, basically, where Freddy has to try to get past Heather, and of course, he's going after Dylan first, which, attack a weakness, and technically for a mother, having a child would be both a strength and a weakness in a situation like this. But of course, Freddy's going to attack it from the weakness the weakness angle, which, the whole nightmare thing, which I thought that was a nice little connection. And of course, this whole thing kind of ties in nicely with how Freddy and Nancy have their relationship in the two normal films, where it's like a weird hate relationship, but there's a little bit of subtlety to it, a little subtext to it, which there's one scene in this film which I did not even notice until they pointed it out on the Never Sleep Again thing. But at one point when Heather is thrown against the wall, if you look very carefully, and I actually looked for it when I watched the film this time, you can see written on the wall is the word lust, which that kind of sums up the subtext of their relationship, more so from Freddy's side with Nancy. And there's a little bit of that in this, even though this is a darker, demonic Freddy, there's a little bit of it there. And of course, Nancy, as I mentioned before, when I reviewed the first one, how the last part of the first film is kind of her, taking the power back. Heather's character in this one really does have that too. And there is a moment where she kind of has like a "get away from her, you bitch" moment where she tells Freddy to f himself and then punches him real good. It's like yeah. Acting wise, the best performances in the film come naturally from Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund. Now, of course, at first they're playing fictionalized versions of themselves, and then by the end, Englund is playing a darker Freddy, which you can tell he's having fun playing a darker Freddy, especially after a couple years of playing a slightly comedic Freddy. Even though he was still having fun with that, but I think he likes playing the darker one better, or more the one that's balanced between it. But him, you can tell he's having fun with Freddy. And Heather, when she brings some of the Nancy character into herself in the last act, very strong. John Saxon, he does a good job playing himself, and then of course going back to some of that little Lieutenant Thompson vibe, going back into Lieutenant Thompson by the end. Tracy Middendorf as Julie, she does an okay job for what her role is. Same thing with David Newson as Chase. Wes Craven and Robert Shea as themselves. Shea criticized himself because he think he could have done a better job, but for what little his character has to do in the one scene he's in, I don't think he did that much of a bad job. This is not the first time he's been in front of the camera in these films. It's just he's always had minor roles, like the one teacher in Part 4. In that scene, he does a better acting job, but as himself, I think he comes off a little natural, but there's like a little thing weird about it that maybe he's a little nervous trying to play a fictionalized version of himself. Craven comes off more naturally as it. Though I did like the idea he had originally where he's in the van driven by the guy from The Hills Have Eyes, and they're both sleep deprived, and Wes Craven even has his eyelids cut off, and you can tell he's trying to hide from Freddy while he finishes the script. But alas, he decided to go with the whole mansion. If there's any area in the acting that is weak or so-so, it would probably be Miko Hughes. I would say he does okay as the kid. There's certain scenes where he's better than others. But with kid actors, you're not gonna expect Oscar-worthy material from them, or you expect them to at least be competent or at least go okay with their scenes. And Miko, for the films I've seen him in as a kid, probably his best one would probably be Pet Sematary, but then again, he doesn't really have a lot of dialogue until it's the evil him, and I don't think he was doing the dialogue, except for the scene where he says no fair. Here, he does okay as Dylan. Like I said, certain scenes he's better in than others, and certain bits of dialogue was like, okay, he could have delivered that a little bit better, but certain ones it's like, okay, it's a little, I wouldn't say wooden, but or it's a little bit unbelievable, but it's supposed to be a kid delivering it, like when he's saying the story of Hansel and Gretel from memory. The way he says it's like, yeah, I can imagine a kid doing it from memory, sounding it like that. But at the end of the day, his performance doesn't really bother me, because like I said, it's a kid. You're not going to expect him to be Oscar-worthy or to recite Shakespeare like Kenneth Branagh would. But you would expect him to at least be competent, and I think for what he has to do, he is. His better parts are where it's just him in the facial expressions, and of course him screaming. Like one scene where Robert as Freddy scares the crap out of him, where he's going, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, and he just jumps out. And just how Miko reacts in character like that, that's a scene. That's like that. It's like, alright, that's why they picked him. The music is done in the film by J. Peter Robinson, and it fits the tone of the film very, very well. And I do like the orchestrated version of the main theme at the end of the movie. And the cinematography by Mark Irwin, excellent as well, really does fit the tone of the film. And this is another thing I never noticed as a kid, but I noticed now, is that, maybe I did notice it, I just didn't really chalk up a lot to it, is that there's no opening credits. That kind of adds to the whole reality versus fiction vibe of the film, or at least that's what Wes was going for, and I think it works a little bit, especially with how that opening scene is filmed, and then at first it looks like a normal opening scene, then goes into like, a meta scene, more blood, all that. Like I said earlier, between the first third and this film, it goes back and forth between which one is my favorite. I always will have a place in my heart for this film because of the fact it was the first time I saw Dark Freddy. And if you haven't really watched a lot of the Nightmare on Elm Street films, if there were 3 I would recommend you, it would be 1, 3, and this one over the rest of them. And of course, I would recommend Freddy vs. Jason too, but that's more once you've seen a couple of these films, then go into that one. My rating for the film is 4 out of 5 stars, and as you can tell, it does come with my high recommendation, especially if you are a fan of slasher films or horror films in general.